They like to invent their own gods. The very definition of insanity. Hello! My name is Monster Half-Life, and today we're talking about Kuo Toa, fish people who have been bestowed with the power to create their own gods, if enough of them believe. So how does this affect their stat blocks? Well, it doesn't. They have no guidelines whatsoever in 5th edition for creating stats for a Kuo Toa god. I will go into some detail on my thoughts of what to do for that in the homebrew section, but for now I will be talking strictly about the stat blocks in the 2024 Monster Manual. Truthfully, I think they've lost some pretty good stuff as compared to their 2014 counterparts. They don't have the slippery trait anymore, which gave them advantage against being grappled, and the Archpriest in particular lost a lot of their spells in the conversion. So I will also be giving some tips on how I would change the stat blocks for each Kuo Toa variant as I go through each of them. And before the video starts, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos. And especially leave a comment down below if there's any monsters that you want to maybe see me make a video on. Right now I'm just making videos on monsters that I find interesting, but if you leave a comment, I'll look into it, and maybe I'll make a video on it. Thank you! First up, we have the regular Kuo Toa stat block. With an AC of 13 and an HP of 18, they are meant to be the foot soldiers of the group. They're not going to be taking you on by themselves. They have a dark vision of 120 feet and a true sight of 30 feet, which means that any illusions or invisible creatures within 30 feet of them just don't work. They have the Amphibious trait, which lets them breathe air and water, which pairs nicely with their swim speed of 30 feet, and they also have sunlight sensitivity, which means that they have disadvantage on ability checks and attack rolls in direct sunlight. So this implies that they're going to be fighting you at night and trying to drag you into the water. Now, like I said in the previous section, they are missing their slippery trait, which gives them advantage against grapple checks. But I would personally just give it back to them. It's not really going to break the game if they have advantage against grapples. Now, as for actions, they have 2. They have their Spear, which does 1d8 plus 1 piercing damage, and has a +3 to hit. And they have their Sticky Net, which forces the target to make a dexterity saving throw of 10, and on a failure, the target is restrained until the net is destroyed. The net has 5 HP, 10 AC, and is immune to bludgeoning, poison, and psychic damage. A creature can also take the Athletic action, DC of 10, to try and free themselves or another creature within 5 feet, destroying the net on a success. To kind of sidetrack a little bit, the strategy of the Kuo Toa is going to very much depend on where they are. If they're on land trying to capture someone, they're not going to be lethal about it. They don't want to sacrifice you until they're in their lair in front of their god's statue. Once they're there, yeah, of course they're going to try and kill you then. As for their reactions, they have a reaction called Sticky Shield, and it triggers when a creature misses the Kuo Toa with a melee attack roll using a weapon. They have to make a strength saving throw, DC 11, or their weapon will stick to the Kuo Toa's shield. If the target doesn't let go of the weapon, they are grappled while their weapon is stuck. While it's stuck, the weapon can't be used, but they can take another athletics check, DC 11, to try and free their weapon and end the grapple. Now, 2 things I would do to change up the stat block. I would change up their Sticky Net, first of all. I wouldn't change any of the statistics. I would just change how many times a Kuo Toa can do it. As of now, they can only do it once a day. And while they're trying to capture someone, a once-a-day net isn't very good. I would bump it up to either 2 or 3 times a day, or have it be a recharge, like a recharge of 6. But it's also going to depend on how many Kuo Toa there are there, and you don't want them spamming the net the whole time to try and capture one person. And lastly, for their Sticky Shield, I would have it work on any melee attack roll, not just ones with weapons, because it doesn't really make sense to me that they would be able to stick your sword, but if your fist punches the same shield, it wouldn't stick. That doesn't really make sense to me. So I would change it to be any melee attack. It would give the party a pause on trying to just punch this thing, and it would give them a bit more strategic advantage. The Kuo Toa Whip, due to having devotion to whatever god the Archpriest had made up, is slightly higher up on the ladder than regular Kuo Toa are. They have very slight magical powers, but they are mostly known for their pincer staff and also being able to conjure a slimy magical glob. The pincer staff is a +4 with a reach of 10 feet and does 2d6 + 2 piercing damage on a hit. Also on a hit, they can grapple a target as long as they're medium or smaller, but until the grapple ends, they can't make any more pincer staff attacks. Now, Conjure Slimy Blob has a range of 60 feet, a +4 to hit, and it does 3d4 + 2 acid damage on a hit. Now, with 45 HP and only 11 armor class, they are not super high up on the minion list, but they're still better than regular Kuo Toa. With a bonus action twice a day, they can cast Shield of Faith, which will boost their armor class from 11 to 13, putting them on par with the regular Kuo Toa. And that's about it. They lost Slippery, like the other Kuo Toa have, but they also lost their multi-attack when they were ported from 2014 to 2024. In 2014, they also had a bite attack, which did 1d4 + 2 piercing damage, because, well, the pincer staff can only be used once unless they're constantly dropping people out of grapple. But why would they do that? They're using the pincer staff to weaken someone and drag them into the ocean, so it doesn't really make sense for them to only have that as a melee attack. So, for what I would do, I would homebrew it to give them back their multi-attack, but only for their melee attacks. They can use their bite twice, or they can use the bite and the pincer staff. The Conjure Slimy Glob should only be used once. It's more powerful than both options, and I don't think you should be able to just use that willy-nilly more than once per turn, especially for the power level that these guys are supposed to be. The Kuo Toa Monitor is most likely going to be the pack leader when it comes to raiding parties at night. They are stronger than both the regular Kuo Toa and the whips, and they are a little bit beefier, but not by much. They have 65 HP and an AC of 13, so their armor class is pretty similar to the regular Kuo Toa, but they have more HP. One thing I do find strange, though, is that they are described as training the animals that might go along with them during the raids, like giant crabs, for example. But they don't have the animal handling skill. Now, this isn't going to make any difference in battle, but I'd give them the animal handling skill. For no other reason than it just makes sense because they're training animals. For their attacks, they have their Bone Whip, which conjures both the ruthlessness of regular Kuo Toa and the magic granted by the Archpriest to do their job. They do 1d6 + 3 slashing damage plus 2d6 lightning damage. And when a target is hit, they cannot make opportunity attacks until the start of the monitor's next turn. That's about all they get, and I would change it up a little bit. They get 2 Bone Whip attacks, and they are described as using the Bone Whip to subdue opponents, but it doesn't really have anything that weakens them besides the ability to take away opportunity attacks for a little while. So, my suggestion is that if the Bone Whip uses both attacks and hits both attacks on the same target, it gives them a penalty of some sort. Maybe like a -d4 to their attacks, or maybe a -d4 to their armor class. You can decide what the penalty is going to be, but I would make sure that it does give a penalty to kind of give the enforcer vibe to them that they are frankly lacking in this stat block. The Kuo-Toa Archpriest is the strongest of all the Kuo-Toa, and they are most likely only going to be encountered in the community or in front of like the statue that they make. So they're not going to be encountered during the surface raids. So if you see an Archpriest, they are trying to kill you. They're not trying to spare you like the other ones are. With a 105 HP and an AC of 13, and an initiative of +2, unlike the other Kuo-Toa who have a +0, they are tankier than the other ones, surprisingly, because they're priests. With a +9 to perception and a true sight of 30 feet, like all the other Kuo-Toa have, it's going to be a lot harder to sneak up on them as compared to the other ones. They have two things that they can do on their turn. They have their multi-attack, which lets them do 3 strange scepter attacks, or they have their spellcasting. Though, truth be told, most of their spellcasting is utility, with only one of the spells being Destructive Wave, having any sort of damage capabilities whatsoever. Being fair, Destructive Wave is a very powerful spell. They lost a lot of spells from the conversion from 2014 to 2024, though truth be told, with the changes to Strange Scepter, you don't need most of them. I will only be adding 1 spell back to their repertoire as a homebrew, but I'll get to that when I get to that. The Strange Scepter attack, which they can do 3 times per round, has a +6 to hit, and can either be melee with a reach of 5 feet, or it can be a ranged attack at 120 feet. Now, the damage is pretty crazy, with each hit doing 5d6 plus 3 lightning damage. It's a bit insane, which is also why I'm saying they don't really need their other damaging spells, because their Strange Scepter is going to be doing more than any of their damage spells possibly could have done. Now, for their spell casting, at will they can cast Detect Magic and Thaumaturgy. You don't really need those in combat, but it's nice to know that they have them. And then once a day, they can cast Destructive Wave, Divination, Hold Monster at 6th level, Scrying, or Tongues. Destructive Wave is going to be the only one you're probably going to be using in battle besides Hold Monster, which it ripples outward from you in a 30-foot emanation, and you can choose which creatures get affected by it, and the ones that do must make a Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, they take 5d6 thunder damage and 5d6 radiant or necrotic damage, and they get knocked prone. On a successful save, they still take half damage, but they don't get knocked prone. This one's very useful as either a starting move or an attack when people are very close by. Knocking your opponents prone, especially with a lot of damage like that, is very good for the rest of his minions to go and beat up the people who are prone. Or the Archpriest could get down and dirty with it and beat people with their stick that does 5d6 plus 3 lightning damage. The only other once a day spell that you're going to be using in battle is probably Hold Monster, which can be used to try and paralyze 2 different people. Now, for those who don't know, if you're hit with a melee attack while you're paralyzed, it not only has advantage, but if you hit, it's an automatic critical hit on the opponent who's paralyzed. So this is a very devastating type of thing to be used on your party. But again, it's only once a day, so they'd probably pick the targets that have the lowest wisdom. Well, how would they know who has the lowest wisdom? Well, with Divination and Scrying, they're probably getting information on the party before the party gets there. So you can use those 2 spells as an excuse to be a little more metagamey. Tongues is good for roleplay, as the Kuo-Toa, all of them, only know Undercommon. So most likely your party doesn't know what they're saying, because in the years that I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons, I've never seen anyone pick the Undercommon language. As a bonus action, they can cast Shield of Faith twice a day, and so they're most likely going to be casting that first thing in the round. It's concentration, and it's most likely not going to drop unless they use Hold Monster. So for most of the battle, the Archpriest's AC is probably going to be a 15 instead of a 13. Enough about the Kuo Toa themselves. Let's move on to the tactics portion of the video. Now, the tactics of the Kuo Toa are going to very much depend on if you're on the surface or if you're in their lair. Because if you're on the surface, they're not trying to kill you. They're trying to subdue you. Because I don't want to kill people unless they're in sacrifice to their gods. So, while you're playing Kuo Toa on the surface, make sure that they're trying to non-lethally take down the opponents. Which means that they're going to be using non-lethal attacks. Depending on if you use any of the homebrew suggestions I gave you or not, the fight may be tougher or not as tough. The regular Kuo Toa, you're probably going to want to use 6 or 8 of them. Just depending on how many party members there are, you probably want to have 2 Kuo Toa per party member. Depending on if you use the homebrew suggestion for their sticky net, they're going to either have just 1 sticky net, or they're going to be having a constantly recharging sticky net. They want to be in melee range with everyone, because they want to be able to use their sticky shield to get the melee people, and they want to use their sticky net on people who are not in melee, like the mages or the healer clerics. People like that, you know? They're going to want to use their spear to weaken their opponents and try and knock them out so they can't really struggle when they're being dragged underwater. The Kuo Toa Whip is going to be conjuring slimy globs from the back line to try and weaken opponents, and then once the opponent is thoroughly weakened, they're probably going to move up to use their pincer staff, which has a range of 10 feet. So they don't need to get into melee with the opponent to be able to hit them with it. If you used the homebrew suggestion for them, then they might be in melee a little bit more as they are using their bite attack to weaken opponents, but if you're not, they're going to be attacking from the back line using Slimy Glob. As for how many I would do, I would probably do 1 per player up to 4. Right, I wouldn't have more than 4 on the battlefield at any time. But if there's less players, then I'd have less of them. For the monitor, I would only have 1 or 2. I wouldn't have too many. But they're going to be right up there with the regular Kuo Toa because they only have their Bone Whip. But also, depending on if you use my homebrew or not, is going to do how many opponents you're going to be attacking with them. If you're not using my homebrew, then they'd be attacking as many melee people as possible. Since they have 2 attacks, they'd be trying to hit them with 1 attack each to make sure that they can't make opportunity attacks, while the other Kuo Toa are dragging their friends into the ocean. If you are using my homebrew, then they'd probably use both attacks on 1 person to not only make sure that they can't do opportunity attacks, but that they are weakened a little bit. Now, depending on if the party is higher level or lower level is also going to determine what kind of beast/monster the Kuo Toa are going to be using in combat. If they're weaker, like let's say like level 3 or so, then you're probably going to be using the giant crab, which is only really good for doing a little bit of damage and then grappling the opponents. So they're doing basically what the whip wants to do against weakened opponents. But if you're using a stronger party, like maybe a level 6, then they'll be using the Chul, which are beings that can both grapple and paralyze the opponents, which is pretty insane to be doing, but they're also not trying to kill anybody, as they want to sacrifice them later. Now, something to keep in mind is non-lethal attacks just knock an opponent out. It doesn't give them death saves, because they are just unconscious, they're not dying. So this could be more annoying for the party than just getting knocked out and having to make death saves, because they're unconscious for a while, up to 4 hours if you roll really bad. So keep that in mind while the party is fighting them, and you don't have to drag all of the party down into the depths, you can just drag 2. And if the battle looks like it's losing, they might just take what they have. So keep that in mind while you're fighting them. In their lair, their strategy is going to be a lot different than it is on the surface, because if you're in their lair, that means they get to sacrifice you to their gods, and that means they're aiming to kill. Now, one thing I would also note is that it's going to be a bit of a higher level fight than if it was on the surface because of the Archpriest. They are a CR6, while the next comparable one, the Monitor, is a CR3. So they have a lot more power. So for the foot soldier role, I would get rid of the regular Kuo Toa entirely and relegate that to the Kuo Toa Whip. So that means I would probably give 1 whip per player, depending on how many players there are. For the Monitor, I would give them 1 Monitor per 2 players, so that's about half as many whips. And then the Archpriest there's only going to be 1 Archpriest in the community, as they are leaders of the community, and so if there's 2 Archpriests, they're most likely going to be fighting each other, as well as fighting the other people. One other thing I would allow is probably 1 Chul or 2. Probably not too many, because their paralysis will be very annoying to deal with, and if the players get overwhelmed with too many Chuls, then it just goes to not being fun. But as for strategy, the whips can be on both sides. They are both ranged and melee fighters. So what I would do is I'd probably have half or 3/4 of the whips be in melee to basically try and stop people from getting to the Archpriest, while having like 1 or 2 be back with the Archpriest, flinging slimy globs at their opponents from a distance, because the range is 60 feet. They don't have to be super close. Their Shield of Faith they might cast on themselves, but if they're feeling generous, they might cast it on the Monitor, as they don't have to cast it on themselves. Casting it on the Monitor might be a good idea because they are going to be in melee. The Monitors have to be in melee, using their Bone Whip to make sure that the opponent doesn't get opportunity attacks. But opportunity attacks aren't as necessary underground as it would be on the surface, because they're not trying to run away. So if you're using my homebrew stats for them, they might target 1 person to try and weaken their attacks a little bit, or weaken their AC. As for the Archpriest, while the Archpriest's spooky staff can be used in melee for the same amount of damage as ranged, they have no real reason to be in melee. There's nothing that they can do in melee that they also can't do at ranged. So you're going to want to keep them at range. Their destructive wave is, while less than their ranged attack with their strange scepter, it still has a 30-foot range, right? So they don't need to be in melee for them to use that. Hold Monster is also a 90-foot range, so frankly, they're just going to want to be in the back no matter what. As for homebrew for them, I wouldn't give them too much more than they have. The only thing I would give them is I would let them use Mass Cure Wounds once per day, because they're a priest. They should be able to heal their community as well as attack, and it's very strange that they took that away from the 2024 version, because they had it in 2014. Now, if your players somehow get to the Archpriest, they are going to use their Strange Scepter attack to try and beat them to death before they can really do too much damage. Now, that's also assuming that they don't have any magic items. But we'll get to the loot section next, because they can have some pretty good magic items, and it can give you a pretty good story as to why they have them and what kind of gods they can make with them. The loot of the Kuo Toa can be pretty interesting, as they get to roll from the relics table. So they can have anything from a parapet of health to maybe something more powerful like a staff of swarming insects, or even a Rod of Alertness. But whatever they pick, I don't think they themselves should get it. I think it should be equipped to whatever type of god that they make. Now, a god that they make can be either a completely new stat block or an edited stat block, but I think the edited version of the stat block should be contingent on the magic item. For example, one of the magic items that you can get is a Ring of Resistance, which gives you resistance against one type of damage. So let's say someone has a Ring of Necrotic Resistance. I think that should feed into the changes that you give to the creature's stat block as they revere this creature as a god that is able to resist necrotic damage. They become a god of death that gives them more things like maybe an upscaled chill touch, maybe? Something along those lines. Or if they get a parapet of proof against poison, they become a poison god, being able to spew toxic gas from their mouth, or maybe it leaks from their eyes. They have a kiss of death, something along that nature. However you decide to do it, I think that it should be themed based on the magic item. So once the Kuo Toa are dead and the quote-unquote god loses their power, maybe only the staff remains, or the magic item remains. Or maybe it's something more like you still have to fight the creature that was being revered as a god, but it's easier because they're not being powered by the belief of the Kuo Toa. While there are no rules itself onto making Kuo Toa gods, I think that Baldur's Gate 3 shows off what they can do pretty well. They worship a red cap, which gives itself the moniker of Bual, to give itself more power from the belief of the Kuo Toa. Now, if they stop believing in the red cap, or you kill them all before you kill the red cap, it loses its power. So it's not an infinite source of power, but other creatures could use this power to their advantage. What would you do there? Well, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft has some pretty good suggestions on where to start. They have a list of minion traits that they could have in the monstrous minion section, such as Alien Mind, making sure that you can't read the creature's mind, or maybe Bodyguard, which lets the minion take an attack instead of its master. But another thing it suggests is taking monstrous traits from other monsters and putting it onto this new monster, which I think is a good idea for making gods. For example, let's say that they're believing something is a fire god because of maybe the creature had a staff of fire, and so it made the Kuo Toa believe that it could control fire itself. Well, the belief could give the creature resistance or immunity to fire, plus give them the flame body trait from something like the fire elemental. Or maybe they saw a troll regenerate itself after a battle, and so they think this creature is a god of life, and so it gives them some sort of healing touch, or maybe its blood can cure diseases. Or maybe a mage happens to have a parapet against poison, which makes them immune to poison. So it makes the Kuo Toa believe that they are a god of poisons. So maybe they get to add a little bit of extra poison damage to all their attacks. Or maybe their blood is poisonous, so if it spills onto their opponent, they'll take a little bit of poison damage. Things of that nature. You have to kind of think a little bit outside the box, as anything really can become a Kuo Toa god. Even a statue can become a Kuo Toa god, as long as they believe hard enough. So whether it's going to be a monster that gets empowered because the Kuo Toa see them in action and believe that they're some sort of god, or maybe a mage or a fighter of some sort is taking advantage of their beliefs and using it to draw more power into themselves. Either way, it's a pretty good idea to buff up the monsters a little bit, but also make sure to keep the buffed monsters in mind while building encounters. You don't want to ruin an encounter because the quote-unquote Kuo Toa god is too strong. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed my breakdown of the Kuo Toa stat blocks, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of this in your own games. They're pretty good enemies for early game and okay enemies like early mid game, but after that, most of them are too weak to be used even as minions for bosses, except like maybe the Archpriest. Now, you could still use them late game. Their potential to create gods through belief alone is stronger than any other race in D&D at all. So the villain might be using thousands of them to try to ascend to godhood. Or maybe you're trying to sway their beliefs to have them believe in you to get more power to fight the big bad evil guy. There's a lot that you can do. And they're little freaky creatures that can do a lot more than the book tends to let you know about. But anyways, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and this is Monster Half-Life.
I like to eat children! Ah!